The sun had barely begun its descent, painting the Manhattan skyline with hues of amber and rose, when the black limousine pulled up to the quiet corner cafe. The establishment was small compared to the glittering skyscrapers around it, tucked away on a side street that locals adored for its charm. It was the kind of place where artists sketched by the window, writers hunched over laptops, and elderly couples shared soft conversations over steaming cups of coffee. On this particular day, however, the cafe was about to host a visitor it had never seen before, a billionaire who rarely stepped into spaces so ordinary. Khalid Al-Mansour emerged from the limousine with his usual commanding presence. His tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and stern expression created a striking contrast to the warmth of the cafe. At his side was a young girl of about 11. She clutched a notebook tightly against her chest, her eyes darting around with both curiosity and trepidation. Her name was Layla, and she was mute. Though her silence had been a source of sorrow for Khalid, it was also the reason he guarded her with such ferocity. Inside, the cafe buzzed with quiet energy, coffee machines whirring, cups clinking, and soft jazz filling the air. The door chimed as Khalid stepped in, and conversations briefly hushed before resuming. He led Layla to a corner table, his protective gaze sweeping the room as though every stranger might pose a threat. Wealth and power had taught him to trust no one, not even in a place as benign as this. The waitress who approached their table was a young black woman named Amina. She wore the cafe's simple uniform, a black apron tied neatly around her waist, and her warm smile carried a gentleness that contrasted Khalid's guarded demeanor. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice friendly but professional. "Welcome to Willow Cafe. May I take your order?" Layla looked up at Amina, her wide eyes glistening with curiosity. She tapped her fingers nervously against her notebook, clearly wanting to communicate but hesitant. Khalid, accustomed to speaking for her, opened his mouth to order. Yet before he could, something extraordinary happened. Amina tilted her head slightly, then slowly raised her hands. With practiced ease, she signed, "What would you like to drink?" For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Khalid's expression hardened into disbelief, his eyes widening as though he had seen something impossible. Layla's face, however, lit up like a lantern in the dark. Her small hands flew into motion, responding in sign language with a fluency and excitement that startled her father. "I'd like hot chocolate," Layla signed eagerly, her movements graceful yet rushed, as though afraid the moment might vanish. Amina's smile widened, her eyes softening with understanding. She replied just as fluently, "One hot chocolate coming right up. Extra marshmallows?" Layla nodded vigorously, her lips curving into a grin. Khalid sat frozen in silence, his usually unshakable composure broken. In all the years of raising his daughter, he had rarely seen her so animated, so alive. Tutors had been hired, expensive programs explored, yet Layla had always remained reserved, communicating only in short phrases with her family. And now, in this small, unassuming cafe, a waitress had drawn out a side of his daughter he thought was buried forever. The air around their table shifted. Other customers barely noticed the quiet miracle taking place, but for Khalid, the entire cafe had dissolved into background noise. His sharp eyes studied Amina as she jotted down the order, her hands moving between pen and sign with effortless grace. There was nothing pretentious about her, no hint that she recognized the importance of the man sitting before her. She had simply reached out to a little girl in silence and offered her a voice. Khalid cleared his throat, his voice low and deliberate. "You know sign language?" Amina glanced at him, unfazed by the weight of his stare. "Yes," she replied softly, placing the order pad against her apron. "I grew up using it. My younger brother is deaf." There was no arrogance in her tone, only sincerity. Yet her words struck Khalid like an arrow. For years he had surrounded himself with the best money could buy, yet here was someone ordinary, someone overlooked, who had managed to reach his daughter in a way no amount of wealth had achieved. As Amina walked away to prepare the order, Khalid leaned back in his chair, still shaken. His gaze turned to Layla, who was scribbling something furiously in her notebook, her cheeks flushed with joy. When she turned it toward him, his breath caught. On the page, in her careful handwriting, were 3 words: "She understands me." For Khalid Al-Mansour, a man who thought he had seen everything, the moment was nothing short of transformative. And yet, as he sat in that small cafe, with the scent of roasted coffee beans hanging in the air, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something far larger, something that would challenge everything he believed about power, connection, and the unspoken language of the heart. The cafe door swung shut behind a pair of departing customers, leaving Khalid and Layla in a cocoon of warmth. The hum of conversation resumed around them, but Khalid's attention remained fixed on the memory of his daughter's radiant smile. He had seen her smile before, of course, but never like that, never with such light, such freedom. It unsettled him almost as much as it moved him. When Amina returned with their order, her steps were unhurried, her presence calm. She set a steaming cup of black coffee before Khalid and placed the hot chocolate in front of Layla, topping it with a mountain of marshmallows. Then, without a word, she signed directly to the young girl. "Careful, it's hot." Layla nodded eagerly, mimicking the sign for thank you before carefully lifting her mug. The sight was so ordinary and yet extraordinary at the same time that Khalid found himself staring, almost forgetting to touch his own coffee. "You're good with her," he said finally, his deep voice breaking the silence between them. Amina glanced at him, her hands folding neatly in front of her apron. "She's good with me," she replied with a soft smile, before returning her gaze to Layla. Her eyes never treated the girl as fragile or broken. Instead, she saw her as whole, capable. And Layla, in turn, responded with a trust Khalid had struggled for years to earn. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his sharp features thoughtful. Conversations about his daughter's muteness had always been clinical, bound up in medical terms and expensive solutions. Here, in this cafe, it was different. It wasn't about what Layla lacked. It was about how she lived. Layla tapped her notebook and scribbled quickly before turning it toward Amina. "Do you like drawing?" Amina's face lit up. She raised her hands, replying in signs so fluid they resembled a dance. "Yes, I love drawing." "What about you?" Layla nodded, so hard her curls bounced. She opened to a fresh page and began sketching clumsy outlines of a flower, her tongue peeking out in concentration. Amina leaned down, encouraging her with gestures, helping her refine the petals. Their silent exchange unfolded effortlessly, each sign and scribble weaving a thread between them. Khalid watched, a strange tightness in his chest. It was as though the world had shifted around him. His daughter, his quiet, withdrawn daughter, was not just participating but thriving in this exchange. He thought of the countless hours he had spent sitting in sterile offices with therapists, watching Layla retreat further into herself. Yet here, with nothing but crayons, paper, and kindness, she was blooming. He wanted to interrupt, to ask questions, to demand how this young woman had learned to communicate so fluently. But something held him back. For once, it was not about him, not about his control. This moment belonged to Layla, and for the first time in his life, Khalid found himself stepping aside. After a while, Amina excused herself to serve another table, leaving Layla scribbling happily. When she returned, Layla held up her notebook again. "You're my friend." Amina's lips parted in surprise, and her eyes softened with emotion. She signed gently, "Yes, I'm your friend." Then she reached out and placed a hand over her heart before pointing to Layla. It was a gesture of sincerity, one that needed no translation. Khalid exhaled slowly, realizing he was gripping his coffee cup too tightly. He set it down, forcing his composure. A man who could close billion-dollar deals with steady calm now found himself unmoored by the simple bond forming before him. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his voice gruffer than he intended. Amina tilted her head. "Most days. This cafe helps me pay for school," she said matter-of-factly. "But if you're asking about Layla, she's welcome here anytime." Her words carried no trace of flattery, no acknowledgement of his status. She spoke as though she were addressing any father, any child. The sincerity of it unsettled him. People rarely spoke to Khalid without calculation. Yet here was a woman who offered something priceless, without asking for anything in return. Layla tugged her father's sleeve, eager to sign. "Can we come back?" For a moment, Khalid hesitated. His instinct was to guard, to keep the world at bay. But as he looked into his daughter's pleading eyes, he knew his answer. "Yes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We'll come back." Layla beamed, hugging her notebook to her chest. Amina smiled as she turned to serve another customer, unaware of how profoundly she had shifted the course of two lives in a single afternoon. For Khalid, who had always believed that money could solve anything, the encounter was humbling. In the silence between his daughter and the waitress, he saw something money had never been able to buy: connection, belonging, and a bridge across the quiet that had once seemed impenetrable. As the evening light spilled through the cafe's windows, Khalid realized this was no ordinary bond. It was the beginning of something deeper, a silent bond that would soon unravel truths far beyond what he expected. The following week, the cafe felt less like an unfamiliar stop and more like a quiet sanctuary. Khalid found himself arriving earlier than expected, his sleek black car drawing curious glances from passers-by as he parked across the street. It wasn't his usual scene. He was more accustomed to boardrooms, luxury lounges, and private clubs, but for Layla's sake, he was willing to return. Layla skipped ahead, her notebook clutched tightly, her excitement unmistakable. The bell above the cafe door jingled as they stepped inside, and there was Amina, wiping down a counter. Her eyes brightened the moment she saw Layla, and she waved in greeting before signing, "Welcome back." Layla practically sprinted toward her, hands flying as she signed, "I brought my drawings." She fumbled to open her notebook, revealing pages filled with sketches, flowers, stick figure families, a giant sun smiling above crooked houses. Amina knelt beside her, flipping through the pages with genuine awe. "These are beautiful," she signed, her gestures deliberate, encouraging. "This one looks like you." She pointed to a stick figure girl with curly hair and a wide smile. Layla giggled silently, covering her face with her hands. Khalid watched from their table, his heart tightening again. It was rare to see his daughter so expressive, so unguarded. Amina soon brought their usual orders: coffee for Khalid, hot chocolate for Layla. But instead of walking away, she sat down across from them. She placed her tray aside, her apron still tied neatly around her waist, and leaned forward as if the three of them were equals, not billionaire, waitress, and child. Layla, encouraged, began writing quickly on a blank page. "Tell me a story." Amina paused. "A story," she repeated aloud, her brows lifting. When Layla nodded, eyes shining with anticipation, Amina's smile deepened. She raised her hands and signed slowly, making sure Layla followed. "When I was your age, I lived with my grandmother. She told me stories every night. She didn't have much money, but she had imagination. She said imagination makes you rich." Layla's lips parted in silent wonder. She copied the sign for imagination, her fingers sketching invisible pictures in the air. Then she scribbled in her notebook, "What kind of stories?" And so Amina told one. She described, through gestures and words, a tale of a bird that dreamed of touching the stars but had wings too small to fly. The bird asked other animals for help, and though many mocked him, one tiny firefly agreed. Together, they rose into the night sky, not because of size or strength, but because of friendship. Layla leaned forward, mesmerized, her hands fluttering as she mimicked the bird's flapping wings. She signed clumsily, "I like the firefly. It's small but brave." "Yes," Amina replied, her gaze warm. "Sometimes the smallest voices shine the brightest." Khalid sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. He was not used to stories. Numbers, strategies, mergers, those were the language of his world. Yet as he watched Layla and Amina communicate, he realized how starved his daughter had been for this. Not clinical sessions with experts, but connection, warmth, and stories that spoke to her heart. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had been looking in the wrong places all along. When the story ended, Layla pushed her notebook toward Amina again. This time she had written, "Tell me about you." Amina hesitated. Few people ever asked her that question, let alone with such sincerity. She signed slowly. "I grew up not far from here. My grandmother raised me. Life wasn't easy, but she taught me to be proud of who I am. She said kindness is stronger than anything else." Layla nodded, as if absorbing every word. Her pencil moved again. "You're kind." Amina laughed softly, her hand covering her mouth. "So are you," she said, tapping the girl's notebook affectionately. Khalid cleared his throat, his voice low. "And what about sign language? How did you learn?" The question seemed casual, but Amina caught the weight behind it. She looked at him evenly. "My grandmother was deaf," she replied. "I learned so we could speak without words. It became a part of me." Khalid leaned back, studying her. The simplicity of the answer struck him harder than he expected. In his world, skills were investments, learned for profit, power, or prestige. But here was someone who had mastered a language for the sake of love, nothing more. The silence that followed was not awkward but reflective. Amina excused herself briefly to serve another table, and Layla scribbled another drawing. This one of 3 figures, a tall man, a small girl, and a smiling woman with braids. She slid it toward her father, her eyes glowing with unspoken meaning. Khalid's gaze lingered on the drawing, and though he said nothing, the image etched itself into his heart. When Amina returned, Layla proudly showed her the sketch. Amina smiled softly, touched, but Khalid looked away, his jaw tightening. Something was happening here, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. As they prepared to leave, Layla signed to Amina, "More stories next time." Amina signed back with a nod. "Always." Walking back to the car, Khalid realized he had just witnessed his daughter form her first real friendship. It wasn't built on wealth, therapy, or privilege. It was built on stories, kindness, and the language of silence. And that truth, though beautiful, unsettled him more than he could admit. The third visit to the cafe began differently. Khalid noticed it even before they stepped inside. The way Layla's steps were quicker, more confident, as if she were heading toward a second home. For a girl who often shied away from strangers, the change was striking. He adjusted his cufflinks absent-mindedly, wondering if he had underestimated what this place and this waitress meant to his daughter. Inside, the familiar bell chimed, and Amina greeted them with a warm wave. Her smile was effortless, but there was something deeper behind it, a calm strength that Khalid couldn't ignore. She signed to Layla, "Hello, little artist. Did you bring new drawings?" Layla nodded eagerly, producing her notebook once again. But today was different. She didn't simply show her sketches. She wanted to share them in real time. She tugged Amina toward a table, then looked at her father with determination. Slowly, carefully, she signed, "Sit. Watch." Khalid froze. His daughter had just instructed him. Not with pen and paper. Not with a hesitant glance. But with her hands, with her voice. He sat, stunned, while Amina guided Layla through simple sentences. They practiced together. "I am Layla. This is my dad. You are Amina." Each sign was a bridge, a brick in the foundation of a world Khalid had never imagined his daughter could build. And then Amina turned to him. "She wants you to try," she said gently. Khalid blinked. "Me?" Layla nodded emphatically, her curls bouncing, her eyes daring him. He shifted uncomfortably. He was a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts, who spoke fluent French for boardrooms in Paris and Arabic in Dubai, yet here he was, reluctant before the small, deliberate motions of his own hands. Amina leaned closer. "It's not about perfection. It's about trying. She wants you to be part of her world." The words struck him hard. He swallowed, glancing at his daughter's eager face. Then, awkwardly, he lifted his hands. Amina guided him through the first simple signs. "Hello. My name is Khalid." His movements were clumsy, his timing off, but Layla's delighted smile erased every flaw. She clapped silently, her joy infectious. For a brief moment, Khalid felt something loosen in his chest. A barrier, not his daughter's, but his own, was beginning to crack. The practice continued, with laughter filling the small corner of the cafe. Amina encouraged both father and daughter, weaving their attempts into playful games. When Khalid stumbled, Layla exaggerated the correct sign until he got it right, giggling all the while. Other patrons noticed, but Khalid didn't care. For once, the opinions of strangers meant nothing. What mattered was the glow on his daughter's face, the confidence blooming in her gestures. Between lessons, Amina shared more of her life. She spoke of her grandmother, the deaf matriarch who had shaped her into who she was. She told them how people often overlooked her, assuming a waitress couldn't hold depth, strength, or knowledge. But sign language, she said, had taught her that silence wasn't weakness, it was another kind of power. Khalid listened, his gaze lingering on her longer than he intended. There was resilience in her words, a quiet dignity he rarely encountered in the polished circles of wealth. As the hour passed, Layla surprised them all. She put down her notebook, lifted her hands, and signed directly to her father. "I love you." The cafe seemed to still in that instant. Khalid's throat tightened. He had heard those words before, spoken awkwardly or scribbled on paper, but never in her language. Not like this. He mirrored the sign, his fingers trembling slightly. "I love you too." Amina smiled softly, her eyes glistening with pride. She didn't need to speak. The moment spoke for itself. When they finally stood to leave, Layla was practically glowing. She skipped to the door, turning back to sign to Amina. "Next time, teach us more." "Always." Amina signed back, her expression tender. As Khalid guided his daughter toward the car, he felt unsettled. Not by discomfort this time, but by realization. The walls he had built around himself, around his daughter, were starting to crumble. And it wasn't his wealth, his power, or his status that had achieved it. It was a waitress with a kind smile and the language of silence. The cafe became a rhythm, a place that no longer belonged to the anonymity of strangers, but to the beginnings of something far more personal. 3 visits turned into 5, 5 into 7, until Khalid found himself checking his watch during the day, wondering if his schedule would allow a brief escape with his daughter to the quiet refuge on the corner of the street. For Layla, the change was dramatic. Once withdrawn and hesitant, she now eagerly anticipated the afternoons when she would see Amina. Each visit, she carried her sketchbook, not merely to draw, but to communicate. Her pictures became conversations, stories told in color and line, and Amina responded with patience, kindness, and, more importantly, fluency in the silent language that gave those drawings a voice. It didn't take long for Layla to begin including her father. She would sign a phrase and then point to him expectantly, insisting he try. Khalid, though initially clumsy, grew more confident. Amina's gentle corrections and Layla's laughter turned mistakes into shared jokes. Slowly, an intimacy began to form, not only between father and daughter, but among the 3 of them. On one particular afternoon, the cafe was bustling. Every table was filled, conversations overlapping like tangled threads. Yet in their corner, the world felt different. Amina knelt beside their table, showing Layla the sign for friend. Layla repeated it carefully, then turned to her father and signed the word to him. Khalid felt a sharp tug at his heart. His daughter had made a friend, a concept that once seemed unreachable. He looked at Amina, realizing the depth of her role in this transformation. "You've given her something I couldn't," he said quietly when Layla was busy scribbling another drawing. His voice carried an edge of vulnerability he rarely allowed others to hear. Amina shook her head. "No, Mr. Khalid. She already had it inside her. She just needed someone to meet her halfway." Her humility struck him. Most people in his world would have seized the opportunity to remind him of what they had done, what they were owed. But Amina's strength lay in giving without asking for anything in return. It was unsettling and refreshing. That day, for the first time, Khalid ordered coffee for himself instead of remaining a silent observer. He and Amina spoke more while Layla flipped through her sketches, occasionally pulling one of them into her world with an eager tug on the sleeve. Their conversations stretched beyond sign language and into personal stories. Khalid learned that Amina was studying part-time at a local college, working long shifts at the cafe to support herself and her younger brother. He listened as she described her grandmother's teachings, the sacrifices her family had made, and the quiet pride she carried in carving her own path. In return, Khalid shared small pieces of his own life, fragments he rarely gave away outside his carefully guarded circle. He spoke of raising Layla alone, of his constant fear that she would feel unseen in a world that moved too fast. Amina listened without judgment, her eyes soft with understanding. It was during these moments that Khalid began to realize that wealth was not the universal bridge he had once believed it to be. Here, in this cafe, money had no weight. What mattered were the hands moving gracefully between them, the laughter of his daughter, and the conversations that filled a silence that no fortune could buy. As the sun dipped lower that evening, Khalid noticed something unusual. When it was time to leave, Layla hesitated. She tugged on Amina's sleeve and signed, "Come with us." Khalid froze. The invitation was innocent, pure, but it carried an undeniable weight. Layla wanted Amina in their lives, not just in the cafe. Amina crouched down, smiling gently. "Maybe another time," she signed back. "But I'll always be here when you come." Layla nodded reluctantly, clinging to her notebook as if it might carry her friend with her. As Khalid led his daughter toward the door, he looked back at Amina. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting connection, he understood. Unlikely friendships had been formed, ones that would test boundaries he hadn't even realized existed. And he wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew there was no turning back. Khalid had built his life on a foundation of expectations, those of society, his family, and the business empire he commanded. He was used to being judged not only for his success, but also for the traditions he carried with him. Yet, as he returned again and again to the cafe with Layla, he found himself wrestling with something entirely new, the subtle glances and unspoken assumptions of the people around him. It didn't take long for whispers to start. A billionaire in tailored suits, seated comfortably with a black waitress who spoke in signs. It was a picture that unsettled onlookers. Some assumed it was charity. Others, more cynical, imagined scandal. Khalid, who had spent his life carefully curating the image of untouchable dignity, found himself bristling under the weight of those unseen judgments. But Layla was blissfully unaware. To her, Amina wasn't a waitress or a stranger from another world. She was a friend, someone who understood her voice when no one else did. Watching his daughter's openness made Khalid question his own guardedness. One afternoon, as Khalid signed clumsily with his daughter, a group of businessmen seated across the room exchanged knowing smirks. One leaned toward the other and whispered loudly enough to be heard, "I didn't know Khalid was the type to fraternize here." Khalid's instinct was to respond sharply, to remind them of who he was and the weight his name carried. But before he could, Amina placed a gentle hand on the table and signed to Layla with a smile, ignoring the stares. She moved with a confidence that stunned him. Her very presence challenged their narrow views. When the men finally left, Khalid turned to her. "You heard them," he said flatly. "Yes," Amina replied, unbothered. "But why let their ignorance matter? People will always create boxes for others. I just choose not to live in one." Her words lingered. Khalid had lived in boxes his entire life, boxes of wealth, culture, expectation. And here was someone who had every reason to be weighed down by stereotypes but refused to let them define her. The following week, Khalid invited Amina to join them outside the cafe. At first, she hesitated and used to crossing the invisible line between her role as a worker and theirs as patrons. But when she saw the hopeful look in Layla's eyes, she agreed. They went to a nearby park, Layla running ahead, twirling in the late afternoon sunlight. For the first time, Amina wasn't just the waitress. She was simply Amina. She laughed with Layla, teaching her the sign for tree and flower, kneeling down to show her how to spell her name with her fingers. Khalid watched, realizing that anyone who passed by would see them differently than the men in the cafe. Here, in the openness of the park, there were no titles, no uniforms, no assumptions, just people. Later, as they sat on a bench, Khalid admitted, "I used to think my world was small, contained. That wealth could shield me from judgment. But now I see, it doesn't matter how much power you have. People will always try to reduce you to a label." Amina gave a small smile. "And yet, your daughter doesn't see labels at all. She just sees friends." Her words cut deeper than he expected. Layla, in her silence, had managed to do what he couldn't, strip away the barriers of class, race, and status, leaving only the truth of human connection. By the time they returned to the cafe, Khalid no longer cared about the stairs. He noticed them, yes, but they no longer had power over him. If anything, he felt stronger for sitting there, for allowing this friendship to grow in defiance of the expectations around him. That evening, as they left, Amina caught Khalid's gaze. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes breaking stereotypes isn't about fighting loudly. Sometimes it's about living quietly, in a way that makes the stereotype irrelevant." Khalid nodded, his chest heavy with an unfamiliar warmth. He had built empires, moved markets, and commanded boardrooms, but here, in the company of his daughter and her new friend, he was learning a far greater lesson, that true strength lies in challenging the boundaries others place on you and choosing not just to exist within them, but to shatter them. It began innocently, as most storms do. Khalid and Layla had stopped at the cafe on a Friday afternoon, expecting their usual quiet time with Amina. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and cinnamon, and Layla's laughter as she signed to Amina filled the space with a warmth that even Khalid had come to crave. But that day, the atmosphere shifted the moment three sharply dressed men walked in. They were Khalid's business associates, men of stature, men who thrived in the polished corridors of power. Their surprise at seeing Khalid seated in a corner booth with Amina was immediate, and their disapproval showed in the faint curl of their lips. "Khalid," one of them called with forced politeness, approaching the table. "We didn't expect to find you here. May we join?" Khalid forced a smile. "I'm here with my daughter." Their eyes slid toward Amina, and one of them, a man named Rashid, allowed his voice to drop to a near whisper, though everyone at the table could hear. "With company, I see." His tone was sharp, dismissive. Layla shifted uncomfortably. She understood enough from the man's expression, if not his exact words, to sense hostility. Amina, too, caught it. Her smile faltered, but she stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Khalid's jaw tightened. "This is Amina. She is my daughter's friend." The word friend was deliberate, and the room seemed to pause. Rashid chuckled dryly. "A waitress? Your daughter's friend?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "Khalid, this is beneath you." The words hit like a slap. Amina's eyes flickered, a mix of anger and restraint swirling in her gaze. Layla's small fists balled on the table, her lips pressed tightly shut. For years, Khalid had endured similar comments in silence, choosing diplomacy over conflict. But not today. Not when it was his daughter's dignity and Amina's being questioned. "Enough," Khalid said firmly, rising from his seat. His voice carried authority that silenced not only Rashid but the cafe itself. All eyes turned. "You speak of status," he continued, his voice resonant, "as though wealth or title gives you the right to diminish another human being. This woman," he gestured to Amina, "has given my daughter something none of your riches, none of your influence, could provide: understanding." Rashid's smirk faltered, but he still tried to recover. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. Appearances matter, Khalid. People are watching." Khalid stepped closer, his presence towering. "Yes, appearances matter. And today, people will see a man who values respect more than arrogance. They will see that strength lies not in belittling others, but in recognizing their worth." Layla, watching the exchange, suddenly raised her small hands. With deliberate movements, she signed, "She is my friend." The cafe went utterly still. Even those unfamiliar with sign language seemed to understand. A child, voiceless in the literal sense, had spoken louder than all of them. Amina's eyes glistened. For the first time, Khalid saw her vulnerability. This woman who carried herself with such strength was deeply moved by Layla's public defense. Rashid's face darkened, and without another word, he turned sharply and exited with the others trailing behind him. Their departure left the room buzzing, but Khalid no longer cared about whispers. He sat back down, his breathing heavy, and reached for his daughter's hand. "You were brave," he signed clumsily to Layla. She smiled, nodding proudly. Amina finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Khalid replied without hesitation. "Because no one has the right to make my daughter or her friend feel less than they are." In that moment, the confrontation wasn't just with Rashid and his kind. It was with the very prejudices Khalid had once allowed to shape his own worldview. By standing beside Amina and Layla, he wasn't only protecting them, he was freeing himself. The cafe returned to its rhythm, but for Khalid, everything had shifted. The lines that once separated his world from Amina's had been redrawn, not with ink, but with courage. The confrontation in the cafe had felt like a victory in the moment. Khalid walked away with his head high, his daughter's hand in one palm, and Amina's steady presence beside him. But victories, he would soon realize, come at a cost. News traveled quickly in Khalid's world. By the next morning, whispers spread through business circles. The billionaire who dined with a waitress, who defended her in public, who openly defied the unspoken rules of class and status. What had been a personal act of courage in the cafe now threatened to unravel his carefully cultivated reputation. At his office, his assistant hesitated before delivering the news. "Sir, Rashid and the board members are calling for an emergency meeting. They're questioning your judgment." Khalid leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy. He had always been the man others respected, envied even. Now his loyalty to Amina and Layla was being twisted into a weakness. Meanwhile, Amina felt the ripples too. At the cafe, her colleagues spoke in hushed voices when she passed. Some looked at her with admiration, but others with resentment. "She thinks she's special now," one whispered loudly enough for her to hear. She wanted to brush it off, but the weight of being noticed for the wrong reasons pressed down on her shoulders. That evening, Khalid arrived at Amina's modest apartment. His presence in her world was already a spectacle, but tonight he looked weary, stripped of the armor of confidence he usually wore. "They've threatened to pull out of my next project," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "They say I've embarrassed them, made a spectacle of myself." His voice faltered quieter now. "All because I defended you." Amina's heart clenched. She had known that their connection would never be simple, but she hadn't imagined it would cost him so much so quickly. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your world for me," she said gently. Khalid shook his head, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. "It's not about sacrifice. It's about truth. I won't live a life where I'm respected for my wealth, but despised for my humanity." Layla, sitting quietly on the sofa, watched the exchange with solemn eyes. She reached for her notepad and scribbled a single sentence before holding it up. "She makes us better." The simplicity of her words cut through the heaviness of the room. Khalid exhaled slowly, pulling his daughter into his arms. "Yes," he whispered, "she does." But the price of truth was still being exacted. That week, Khalid faced rejection from partners he had worked with for decades. Invitations to elite gatherings stopped arriving. His name, once spoken with reverence, now carried an edge of ridicule in certain circles. For Amina, the price was different but no less heavy. She became the target of subtle cruelties, customers who refused her service, coworkers who excluded her from conversations, neighbors who looked at her with a mixture of envy and disdain. She carried it silently, but inside, it gnawed at her spirit. One night, as the three of them sat together, Amina finally broke. "Maybe it would be easier if I stepped back," she said, her voice trembling. "If I disappear, the world will forget, and you'll get your life back." Khalid's response was immediate and fierce. No, he leaned forward, his eyes blazing. You are not a mistake to erase. You are the truth that exposes their lies. And if that costs me everything, so be it. The room fell silent. In that silence, something solidified. The price of truth was steep, yes, but it was also the foundation of something stronger than wealth, stronger than reputation. Layla reached for both their hands, clasping them together in her small ones. For the first time, Amina realized that while the world outside sought to divide them, within this little circle, they were unbreakable. By the time winter crept into the city, the tension surrounding Khalid had reached its peak. His empire trembled under the weight of rumors, and whispers turned into outright threats. Rashid and the board had given him an ultimatum: cut ties with Amina and restore his image, or risk losing everything he had built. Khalid sat alone in his office that night, staring at the skyline he once believed he owned. Towers of glass and steel rose above the city, monuments to his ambition, but now they seemed cold and fragile, like illusions that could shatter with a single blow. Layla's laughter drifted into his thoughts, her joy when signing with Amina, the way her eyes had lit up as if someone had finally heard her in a world that so often silenced her. That bond was not something Khalid could betray. The next morning, he walked into the boardroom, where Rashid and the other directors sat like vultures waiting for a carcass. Gentlemen, Khalid began, his voice calm but resolute, you've asked me to choose between protecting my empire and standing by the truth. Today, I make my choice. Rashid leaned forward, smirking. Then choose wisely. Your fortune, your influence, it all depends on it. Khalid's eyes sharpened. I will not abandon my daughter, nor the woman who gave her a voice when no one else would. If that means I lose this company, so be it. A stunned silence filled the room. Rashid's smug expression faltered, but before he could retort, Khalid continued. You forget, this empire wasn't given to me. I built it, and if I must, I will build it again from nothing, but this time on a foundation of truth. The directors exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected Khalid to bend, to compromise. Instead, he stood taller than ever, a man no longer bound by their approval. Word of his declaration spread quickly, not just in business circles, but across the public. What the elite saw as reckless, the people saw as courageous. Social media lit up with clips of Khalid leaving the boardroom, his daughter at his side, Amina walking proudly with them. In the cafe where it all began, Amina felt the shift too. Customers who once looked at her with disdain now approached her with quiet admiration. You showed us something real, one woman told her. That wealth doesn't matter if there's no humanity behind it. But the gambit wasn't over. Rashid, furious at being undermined, launched a smear campaign against Khalid, painting him as a man blinded by sentiment, unfit to lead. Deals collapsed, investors fled, and the company's stock plummeted. Khalid had risked everything, and it seemed he was losing. Yet even in the collapse, something powerful emerged. Independent investors and smaller firms began reaching out to him, inspired by his defiance. We want to work with a man of integrity, one told him. Slowly, a new network began to form, not built on elitism, but on respect. At home, Khalid confessed his doubts to Amina. What if I've doomed us? What if I've gambled with my daughter's future? His voice broke in a way she had never heard before. Amina reached for his hand, steady and warm. You haven't gambled, Khalid. You've chosen. And the truth you chose will always rebuild stronger than the lies you left behind. That night, as Layla slept peacefully between them, Khalid knew the battle wasn't over. But the final gambit had been played, and though he had lost the comfort of his empire, he had gained something far greater, a freedom money could never buy, and a bond no power could break. The storm had passed, but its scars remained. Khalid's once mighty corporation stood in fragments, its polished name now synonymous with scandal in the eyes of the elite. The board, under Rashid's leadership, had ousted him, stripping him of titles, privileges, and power. What took decades to build had collapsed in a matter of weeks. And yet, for the first time in years, Khalid felt light. No longer chained to endless meetings and the suffocating weight of appearances, he woke up to mornings with his daughter's laughter and evenings where silence didn't feel like judgment, but peace. Layla, once trapped in a world that never tried to hear her, thrived. With Amina at her side, she blossomed, her hands flying in graceful signs, her expressions bold, her confidence radiant. The little girl who had once clung to her father in fear of the world now taught him how to see it differently, through her language, her rhythm, and her truth. Amina, too, changed. No longer the overlooked waitress in a quiet cafe, she became a symbol of resilience. Stories about her spread beyond the city, about the woman who spoke in silence and taught a billionaire what it meant to listen. She was invited to schools, communities, and even organizations to talk about inclusivity, though she always laughed and said, "I don't give speeches. I just share what I know." Together, the three of them carved out a life not built on skyscrapers or luxury, but on connection. Khalid invested what little he salvaged into projects that mattered, programs for children with disabilities, small businesses run by people once ignored, and scholarships in Layla's name. The returns were not measured in billions, but in lives touched. Rashid, on the other hand, found his hollow victory crumbling. With Khalid gone, the company lost its heart. The empire weakened, investors withdrew, and whispers of corruption tainted Rashid's reputation. He had won the throne, but it was a throne of ash. In quiet moments, Khalid would sit with Amina and wonder aloud, "Did I do the right thing? Walking away, losing everything I built." Amina always gave the same steady reply, "You didn't lose, Khalid. You just found something better." One evening, the three returned to the cafe where it all began. The hum of conversation surrounded them, but no one stared anymore. Instead, customers smiled in recognition. The same tables, the same smell of coffee, yet the weight of that first encounter seemed like a lifetime ago. Layla signed a question to Amina. "Do you think Papa is happy now?" Amina translated softly, watching Khalid's face. He smiled, his eyes warm, and replied in sign, a clumsy but heartfelt gesture he had been practicing for months. "Happier than I have ever been." The cafe filled with laughter, theirs blending with the world around them. For once, Khalid did not feel like an outsider or a man on display. He was simply a father, sitting with the two people who had taught him the meaning of truth. Life did not return to what it once was, but it did not need to. The skyscrapers could crumble, fortunes could vanish, and names could fade from headlines, but the bond forged in silence, in resilience, and in love was indestructible. In the end, Khalid realized the greatest empire he could ever build was not one of glass and steel, but one held together by trust, compassion, and the courage to listen. And so, their story did not end with loss.